That's great. And all right, so the camera's live. Hopefully everybody can see us. One of the things, there's Dr. McCandless. One of the things that we're excited about in this session is that it is interactive. And so um, as opposed to presenting a deck and trying to take you through an argument, we really want this to be a discussion. The discussion is about our changed reality from a research and insights perspective. There's with COVID-19, we had a massive shift into online interactions, and the amount of data that is feeding, that is now streaming on expressions of human behavior and human emotion is now at a scale that we've never faced before, never had an opportunity to analyze before. So this discussion really is about masks and emotional meaning and how we decipher it in interactions, and how this new stream of behaviorally expressive, often emotionally laden expressions that's now coming from hundreds of millions of webcams every day, how is that data stream going to be used by the insights industry to inform our overall analysis of human behavior? How is that going to interact with the other forms of big data that we currently have? So to kick this off, Dr. McCandless loves to be provocative. How about this one? Cyrus, can you show us what you got going on here to stimulate this discussion?
Sure. So I guess an appropriate thing to do would be to ask a question that tends to be rather inefficient in the situation. So, but if you take a look at this and just ask yourself how easy it is to recognize the emotional expressions and to interpret what it is that people are saying to you in a social situation when everyone is wearing masks, I think it makes it very much more evident than it might normally be exactly how much information really is communicated through our facial expressions. And there's a very good reason for that. Aaron, if you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, I think I can advance it here.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I controlled it there, but there you go. That's because the human face is an extremely elaborate set of muscles. Each one of us has the same sets of facial muscles, and they're very highly evolved. We're not like worms or birds or even monkeys to an extent. Our facial musculature really has evolved for the purpose of communication, and you can see that in the extreme amount of detail, the number of muscles that are present in the face. And uniquely, muscles in the face are the only place where you will find a large number of muscles that actually go from skin to skin, that they actually insert into the skin. Their purpose is to control the shape of the skin in the face. And when you take the mask off of this anatomical drawing, you can really get an appreciation for exactly how sophisticated the facial musculature is. And that really is because we've evolved this sophisticated system of social signaling through our facial musculature that's unique to the human species, really in terms of its breadth and depth of communicative capacity.
I love that illustration. It just, and I think your point, Cyrus, on that these are evolved for a very specific purpose of information communication is really critical. And I wonder if that's where the insights industry is falling down, because typically we've labeled, the early innovators in this space have labeled facial action coding emotional measurement. Expression of emotion. It is an expression. Is it necessarily an emotional expression? I think perhaps it's that labeling that is causing our industry to pause on this, because when you use the illustration of the mask, and you say this is a system that's been designed for optimal information communication, and we cover 2/3 of the face, that information communication mechanism. and we now have a harder time interpreting what people are doing. I mean, it just is very obvious that we communicate information through the face. And this is behavioral data. So it's not stated data on how you're feeling. It's not, it is actually an expression of yours while you're communicating. So it's meaningful. And since it's derived as opposed to stated data, it's the kind of data that we as scientists really like, because we're not relying on what somebody's opinion is. We're actually observing behavior. And then we're making conclusions about what that behavior means. And depending on how you control the environment, the context, the experimental conditions, you should, just like with other measures, be able to glean important insight that you wouldn't have been able to glean with just asking just asking questions alone. But that's where I really want the discussion to be, right there, because it seems intuitive. The masks make it easy to understand, right? Of course we communicate information with our face. What are the primary objections for the insights world that's stopping us from grabbing onto this source of information and leaning into it and its promise for insight, rather than rejecting it because it's not universally explanatory of everyone's emotions at every moment? Let me start there to be controversial. Can we start there?
You want my response to that?
Actually, no. I want to hear your response to someone else's response.
Yeah.
Let me ask this question. First of all, is anyone aware that there's controversy around the reliability, sensitivity, validity of facial coding of emotion? Anybody aware of that? Hey, there's one. So there is controversy. It is real. There's a good literature that's trying to make a very specific point on this. And the point is, essentially, when we're angry, sometimes we frown and furrow our brow, and sometimes when we're angry, we don't. Or sometimes when we're happy, we smile. Sometimes when we're angry, we smile. So if that's the reality, like, how do you interpret any of this information? The problem that I'm having and I want to discuss here is the same exact thing is true with any explicit response that you gather in a survey. So why the objection to behavioral data that faces the same problems that any research method faces? Where is this objection or this nervousness coming from in the insights industry? And again, I want to make this point because now we have hundreds of millions of people who are communicating emotionally meaningful information into their cameras every day, and that data can be automatically coded, and the information is meaningful and relevant. So if that's really the data stream that's coming into the insights world's purview to analyze and understand and provide value to the world, I want to understand what the objection is so we can overcome it, address it, and overcome it, and not miss the opportunity for human insight here. So can we dig there? Who wants to dig? Yes, please.
I need to
I'll say something, I think.
Do I need to click live or something?
I can see you and hear you.
Okay, well, apparently I don't need to click live. I have two other objections or questions. Well, one part is it's a much too long conversation to go to Lisa Feldman Barrett's book, but I think there's another question which I always think about as a Finn, because we, as sort of culturally speaking, we are a people of 5 million resting bitch faces, and we're generally speaking, we don't express a lot of emotion in our faces. I've learned to do that because I lived in Anglo countries, but I still have to remind myself. But so the question is more that if you build those algorithms based on Americans who are culturally quite distinct in the amount of ideal affect that that is culturally appropriate or desirable to express explicitly through the face, if that's how you train the algorithms, then it seems like that would be training them on an outlier, because we don't all express emotion as strongly through the face, not in the same way. And that brings me to my second point, that actually the masks are a much bigger problem for Western people from Western cultures, because we are used to looking at the whole face. And when you remove the mouth, when you cover the mouth, we lose a lot of the information from people's faces. But that isn't as much of a problem for pardon the generalization, but that's how the research literature is, that people who've grown up in Asian cultural contexts, they tend to focus their attention much more on the eyes, because and the reason for that is that when it's not a cultural ideal to express a lot of emotion explicitly, and suppress that for the sake of group harmony and so on, social harmony. The eyes are the way that where the emotion leaks out, as it were. So the masks are a problem for us, but they're not necessarily, a globally or universal. Don't want to use the word universal, but I don't think they are not necessarily a problem for everyone. They're just a problem for us.
I would love to run that experiment, level of information understood from someone speaking with and without a mask cross-culturally. I think that'd be fascinating.
Well, we can.
Be able to do that? But I love that comment, and the emotion leaking from the eyes is a wonderful visualization. Alina, to follow up on that question, and I mentioned this in the talk, so cross-cultural differences in emotional expression are evident in many different research tools. I mentioned scale use bias, for example. There are cultures who will never use the extreme of a scale. They'll only use the scale. And there are others who only use the extremes of the scale. Try to sample your Twitterverse and see what your responses on your 7-point scale are going to be. They're going to be the extremes. So if that's the fundamental problem, the fundamental issue that researchers are facing, different degrees of emotional expression depending on the measurement tool that you use, how does scale use bias differ from facial action coding? And anybody, please join in here. How does this particular measurement tool differ or face different challenges than other tools that have cultural biases in them?
Wow, I think I will shut up now, honestly. But I think the most obvious answer for me is that we have been using those other tools for decades, and there is a lot of research looking into that, like research showing how different response biases work, where they're prevalent, and so on. But we don't necessarily know that yet from the facial coding data. And the second thing that I think might be problematic is that for the scales and response biases, that was a little bit more of a manual adjustment, whereas I assume that no one's doing manual facial coding, that this is all done by algorithm. And for an algorithm, presumably, I assume it's by algorithm, then the data that you train it on will influence it, no?
It's wonderful. And I think that's a really important perception that we need to make sure everybody in the industry understands what the technology is doing. And I speak for ours at some of the other really good scientific technologies in the space are doing the same thing, but I can't speak for everybody's facial action coding technology. But in the case, what we're measuring is muscle movement. The interpretation of that muscle movement is a separate exercise. And you need scientists, people who are experts in this kind of data to understand what movements mean and to interpret them appropriately. So just like you wouldn't have a novice go in and tell you whether a difference between two groups is significant or not if they didn't know anything about statistics, the same is true for facial coding data. And I would love for Cyrus to talk about the algorithm and resting bitch face, which we see all the time in our analyses, and how that's accounted for and how it's relative to the individual and change. Cyrus, can you talk a little bit about what the algorithm does and what it doesn't do in these kinds of technologies?
Sure. I think I want to address the first point there in doing that, which is the question about magnitude of expression. And it is true that in social situations, people from different cultures exert differing degrees of top-down, active suppression or enhancement of their facial expressions in an effort to communicate more effectively or to mute their emotional expression if that's what's perceived as appropriate in their culture. However, one of the the literature, the history of this literature is very deep and broad, and there's a lot of detail that we won't be able to get into, but a good example is that it used to be thought, based on the basis of facial action coding, that in general women were more expressive than men. But if you dig a little deeper and you do more experiments, what you find is that that may be true in social situations in certain cultures. But when you take that social context away, in private, the amount of expressivity on the face between men and women is approximately equal. You don't see that difference. So in this particular context, where we have respondents watching ads in a relatively solitary context, or tends to be a solitary or at home context, where they're generally more, feel a little bit more free in their behavior than they would in a boardroom, for example. A lot of those objections just dissolve because now you're in private, and it is absolutely has held up the test of time that these facial expressions, at least for the core set of emotions that we're talking about, really are expressed stereotypically across cultures. Now, when you're talking about differences in ethnicity, yes, you're right. Those do have to be accounted for in the model, and specifically how it's trained. And our models were, in fact, trained on a balanced and very broad set of ethnicities. So, again, those go away. Again, you're absolutely correct that there are models out there that have not accounted for these things, and there certainly are use cases where those cultural differences will be much more impactful in terms of the data that you get and your interpretation of it. But those specific objections do actually melt away when we talk about the specific use context.
That's awesome. Thank you, Cyrus. Ariane, I think you had a question earlier. Did you want to ask a question now?
Well, it's not really necessarily a question, but one of the sort of innovations that I've seen in the face mask wearing during this time was a post about nurses in a NICU wearing masks where they actually had a clear cutout over their mouth because they were sort of concerned about infants not being able to read the expressions of the nurses because they couldn't, fully see the face. And, I'm not a nurse, so I don't know enough about that particular topic, but I thought that was interesting in this context about reading emotion of a face and sort of how that changes across lifespan and in terms of learning that emotion from infancy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a ton of research about, mother-child interactions, and this question of, how much of it is innate and how much is learned, and how sort of plastic emotional expressions might be in infancy versus, what happens as you mature into adulthood. Those are a little bit outside the realm of what we're talking about here, because obviously if you want to do facial action coding on babies, you really need a different model. You need to train your model specifically for that if you're, building a model for it. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of babies going out and spending a lot of money on, beer or cars. So they're not really our target demographic. But your concerns are very valid. But it's, it gets really fascinating when you look at mother-child interactions and how much is learned and how much that is learned is unlearned when these stereotype behaviors emerge as the brain matures.
Fascinating. I love that comment. Can we, obviously we want to be sensitive to the time here, can we pivot the conversation to ways in which we think this feed of emotional data might be useful or might be worth exploring or digging in more deeply? What are some of the possibilities with the stream of big emotional data that we've gotten? What would we want to know in order to have confidence in that data or begin to start to draw conclusions from it? So in this example, for example, this is a forced exposure, paid respondents. You expose them to an ad. It's a very controlled environment, so you know exactly what they're experiencing, and that helps with the interpretation. It removes noise, but helps with the interpretation. But what about other sources of emotional or expressive behavior that may be coming through your webcams, like right now? What if a speaker could have a read on the overall general sentiment of their audience while they're speaking, subtracting out the RB. The right acronym there. That's a data source, right? That's a stream of data, and it's happening all over the world on hundreds of millions of computers.
Just to parameterize that,
what does the industry do with that kind of information?
To parameterize that a little bit for the discussion, Lisa Feldman-Baird's absolutely right about one thing, which is her core argument, which is that this cannot be applied on the individual level. It's irresponsible to do so, especially in a legal context or law enforcement context, which is being done right now. It's very irresponsible, and she's absolutely right about that. But again, we're in market research. We're talking about large representative samples where, you know, a certain amount of noise on the individual level is very much tolerable. We're very used to it.
That's great. A really great point. It's dealing with noise. That's really important, the sample size. What do you guys think from the roundtable discussion? What are some of the ways in which what are some of the streams of information, and how might we use it as an industry?
No, I'm happy to jump in with just sort of a first thought, which again, apologies for sort of focusing on youth, but I'm just thinking about like upcoming school year, and I know this sort of veers a little bit out of sort of research specifically, but we think about like the upcoming school year. Are kids going to be going to school, or are they going to be doing distance learning? One of the benefits of school is having that in-person interaction where a teacher can understand how the child is feeling and sort of support them in that whole state. So I wonder if technology like this could actually be expanded in these like larger worlds of, you know, distance learning, distance communication to inform, you know, what that teacher could be reading from students, for example.
What do you think, group? Is there application there? No, I see a head shaking. Too dangerous, too unproven. We got to rely on those explicit survey questions.
One of the beautiful things about this is that, you know, if you're in person and social distancing and wearing a mask, then a lot of these communicative cues that the face gives are occluded, right? You have a harder time understanding what someone's state of mind from their face or nuance of what they're saying. On the other hand, you know, when you are in a webinar sort of context like this, I don't see anyone here wearing a mask. So that does make it, you know, easier to read some of those cues, which we really just interpret as, you know, at a very low sort of intuitive level. It's very hard to articulate exactly what we're seeing, but so there's, you know, it's kind of a trade-off there. It's a very good question.
I love that. I was thinking also, just been in research for so long, and everybody here's probably done this, been in the back room at a focus group and, you know, watched the reaction of somebody in the group, and you elbow the person next to him and say, hey, did you see that? And you start to make your own conclusions. You make entire branding decisions based on the reaction of one person. So the fact that we've added a layer of quantitative data to something that we react to and make decisions on anyway, that's a different frame, right? And so that's a different frame on this information. The majority of these decisions are being made by gut feeling anyway. Adding a layer of emotional intelligence should just hopefully make our decisions more evidence-based, as opposed to based on the gut. But what about the application within online focus groups, within online qual? If we're used to interpreting facial expressions and body expressions in those contexts anyway, and we do it qualitatively, what is the promise of this quantitative measurement of emotional expression within those spaces? Are there applications there?
Especially the lack of masks in that context.
Has anybody used facial coding of emotion in a qualitative setting that's on recall? If it didn't work, you can say yes too, right? Tim, yeah. Let me unmute you. Can't hear you, Tim. Shoot. Still can't hear you.
You might be muted on your keyboard, Tim.
Tim is not muted, but we can't hear him. Yeah, I'm with you. Can you type your question into the chat, Tim, or maybe it's your headphones? There she goes. Anybody else who's used it in a qual setting? No. The thing, this goes back to one of Cyrus's points. The use of this technology within a qualitative setting requires that we pay attention to sample size, obviously, and you also need to understand group dynamics. The way that you're going to express yourself in a room of 12 people may differ from the way you're going to express yourself in a one-on-one conversation, and also in an online conversation with multiple people watching who may not be in the same room with you. So different ways of thinking about this. We're thinking directly about the application within an online qualitative environment where we have control over the environment that's recording the face. Has anybody used it in those circumstances? Online qual with larger sample sizes? Control environment? No. Tim, are we back? There you go. My question in regards to facial recognition for ad testing specifically. Love it for its ability to measure emotion at a point in time, but I wanted to ask how you go about understanding which emotion is most important for a brand to elicit. This is fabulous. And so some of the early criticisms of automated facial coding were really good in that people were taking individual data streams, like a muscle movement that looks like, let's say, concern or confusion, and calling it that specific emotion. And what you really need to do when analyzing facial coding of emotion data is understand the muscles that are moving and what they can potentially portend about what somebody's feeling, and interpret it within the context. So to answer your question, how do you know which emotion is most important for brand to elicit? There are certain emotional states that are expressed on the face, but it's not at the level of precision that captures all of the emotional potential experience of an individual. So what we do in those situations is we combine this facial coding, moment by moment emotional response, with change in implicit emotional associations towards the brand. So for example, let's say your brand is trying to stand for wonder. You're trying to elicit wonder in the minds of your consumer. Just think of it that way, or excitement or something like that. We'll measure the level of excitement or wonder towards your brand before exposure. We'll expose you to the ad, measure your emotions while you're exposed, and then measure those emotional associations with the brand after you're exposed. And so we look at change. But since you have it on the same individual, Tim, you can actually create groups of people who changed in attitude towards your brand. So here's a group of people who feel like your ad is more wonder-based or more exciting, and cut the facial coding data according to those groups. That gives you insight into the different emotional experience of the group that had the emotional outcome that you wanted for your brand. So it's the combination of those two techniques on the individual, and it's causal scientific change. So very, very useful way to understand the kinds of emotions that are most important for your brand, which ones are having the biggest impact on your brand, and what moments of the ad are related to that impact.
Yeah, you really want to get, what you're going for is a persuasive narrative, right? And there really isn't, there are very, very, very loose relationships between what specific emotions are elicited and what constitutes a persuasive narrative. So there really isn't a target emotion that you're going after. What you're going after is to create a coherent and persuasive narrative. And as you know, narratives are creative, and they can go all kinds of different ways. And sometimes a sad narrative makes you love the brand. Sometimes a happy narrative does.
Yeah. And then back to your second follow-up question, Tim. So as Cyrus is saying, different kinds of emotions can get your story across. It really depends on where the brand lodges in the minds of consumers when it's over. And so typically, to understand those emotions that you want your brand to stand for that might differentiate in the marketplace, that's baseline work. So it's implicit associations of the emotions of your brand and your competitor brands, and then some kind of derived, like multiple regression or hierarchical linear model that allows you to tell the importance of those associations in driving preference or price premium for your brand. With that baseline, then you go in with a handful of 3 or 4 emotional associations that are important to your brand equity, and you measure change in those. To Cyrus's point, the story narrative can be all kinds of emotions to get to that endpoint. But if you know ahead of time which emotions differentiate you in the marketplace versus your competition, you can design those studies really well. Sorry, Emily, I see you pop back on. I think we're probably at time.
It's like my virtual version of creeping on the stage. Yeah, so you guys feel free to save that chat over there if there's anybody that you want to follow up with. You need to answer those questions, Aaron or Cyrus. That will shoot an email to anyone's inbox to continue the convo. And for everybody else, the other session started about a minute ago. So feel free to jump. And Aaron, Cyrus, everybody else, thank you so much for contributing. I know it is weird to get over the camera and mic thing and technical difficulties and all that, but I think this went really well. So I appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your IIeX behavior over the next few days.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks,
Have fun, everyone.